So, Rory, thank you very much for taking part in our In Conversation series. I've told this is actually about the fourth one that we've done, but I think what's really interesting is that, just give a bit of background here. So you and I met through another client of mine, which is Redemption Roses, which is the chaps who help ex-offenders get work. So we obviously met through that initiative at Warwick Scrubs, which I have to say was, for me, fantastic. It was a great event. And Darren, who you met, at the time, is doing incredibly well, and he's thriving. So I'll give you a bit of an update on that, which is great, because that's really kind of what it's all about as well. And long may that continue. So thank you again for sending up for Ted and Max, who also say hi. But what a week it's been for politics. I think there's no escaping the fact that politics is everywhere. And interestingly, I was reading an article, an interview with the iPaper. It must have been, it was in November last year. But where you had said that you think Boris Johnson will be toppled by the handling of the COVID crisis, and I think I can somewhat agree with that. But my question is, clearly he's under pressure from the 1922 committee to open up certain things. Do you think with the rollout of the vaccine, there'll be a kind of a bonus effect for Boris going forward, or do you think the British public will be largely forgiven for the sacrifices we've all had to make, and all's well and we're back home for tea and medals, if you like?
I think there's a big bit of the British imagination, which, as you say, tends to focus on endings rather than beginnings. And Boris is in a way, I don't know whether to call him very skillful or just very lucky, because the early handling of COVID was not very impressive. We didn't seem to be doing as well as other countries. We ended up with 100,000 people dead, and far more than I felt we should have had. But of course, the vaccine rollout has been incredibly successful, and much more successful than the United States or European countries. And I think there's a part of the British psyche which quite likes the idea of sort of snatching victory from the jaws of defeat. But if Boris plays it well now over the next few months, he could really benefit from this. And you can see already in the opinion polls that he's soaring up again.
Which I think is really interesting, because obviously the moment, and my background is the Labour Party, and I think Keir's done a good job as a leader of the opposition, but I think the situation for the Labour Party will be, if there's a bonus in effect for Boris, will be, well, where does the Labour Party kind of come back from this, essentially? So it's everything to play for, isn't it?
It's very difficult. I mean, politicians like Boris are very difficult to beat because they don't play by normal rules. I mean, they're essentially populist politicians, of course. And what that means is they're very, very good at putting very simple messages across in a very engaging way. And it's a totally different way of doing politics from the way that you'd naturally think about it. So Keir Starmer, I think, thinks about politics more in terms of grappling with complex policy problems, coming up with his solutions, and he's betting hard that people in the end will vote for him being serious, thoughtful. He's a guy who was a very successful person even before he came into Parliament. Very unusual to come into Parliament with a knighthood. In fact, I think probably the only person to come into Parliament with a knighthood for goodness knows how long, right? But it's a gamble, and it depends on what the public and the media make of it. I mean, do the public and the media care about careful policy analysis? Do they even care about performance? Or is it more about emotions, reassuring people, a vague sort of sense? How forgiving are the public? How fussy are the public? And these are difficult things to answer, but I think those are the things that Keir Starmer is going to struggle with.
I think you're right. And I think it's, it's interesting when you've got the detailed politician who focus on the detail, and you've got Boris Johnson who, for want of a term, is a populist. And I suppose this kind of links me to my next question, because obviously I think it was during the Conservative leadership hustings where you said that Boris Johnson was peddling optimism, which is a very kind of populist thing to do. Now, obviously, Donald Trump is no longer president of the United States of America, which in my opinion is a fantastic thing. Do you think we're starting to see the end of populist politics in some respects? We're starting to see a bit of a shift, and can kind of somewhat relate this to Scottish politics with the SNP, given the poll that came out yesterday. has the referendum, potential second referendum, was 50-50. So it seems to be, is there a shift taking place here? Are people starting to look at the big issues? Are people starting to think about, well, actually, you know, what they say and what they do, two entirely different things. And right now, for me, it's about the family, health, economy, the big issues.
So Biden shows that it's possible to beat a populist, but he also shows that it's difficult.
Yeah.
And that victory over Donald Trump was much more narrow than we would have liked. Basically, if about 110,000 votes had gone the other way, which is not very many in a country of many hundreds of millions, Donald Trump might have won again. And that's because, and that's despite the catastrophic news of COVID and the economy. I mean, that election came at exactly the wrong time from the selfish interests of Donald Trump.
Yeah.
You know, he came at the time which Boris was at, you know, 4 or 5 months ago. So that means that, you know, we shouldn't imagine for a moment that populism is over. I think it's still, all other things being equal, it's easier to win an election as a populist. But they can be beaten, and they must be beaten. And it must be possible to make more serious, thoughtful arguments. And we have to, for the sake of our politics, put a lot of energy to make sure that more sensible, thoughtful ways of thinking about the world comes through in the end. I mean, I think the defeat of the Labour Party in Scotland has been very strange. I mean, I was very struck in Motherwell, for example, where my friend Frank Roy had been the MP for many years. How good he was as a constituency MP, how hard he worked. I mean, he didn't, you know, there was an SNP myth that Labour was sort of somehow taking Scotland for granted.
Yeah.
I didn't feel that with Frank. I felt this was a man who had his constituency office bang in the middle of the high street, who came from Motherwell, who'd worked as a steel worker at the DL plant for 16 years. I mean, anybody more embedded in a constituency would be difficult to imagine. I think he had his wedding in the community centre.
Yeah.
And yet he lost. And that's very, very odd. I mean, it really sort of throws you on your back foot. It leaves you wondering, what on earth are people looking for?
No, it does, and I think you're right. I mean, obviously, we've now got a new leader for the Scottish Labour Party, which is Anna Sarwar, and you know, I think the big question of the Scottish Labour Party is, well, where do we go? What is it we need to do to get back to a position of either being in opposition, or being in opposition, sorry, official opposition, or being in power? And it's one that we'll need to give some real thought to, and hopefully we'll kind of see that change there as well. But for me, it's avoiding not avoiding, but it's about addressing the constitutional argument, which is about a pro-union party, be pro-union, make the case for the union. But at the same time, it's about saying this is what matters to the people of Scotland. I think it's been highlighted by COVID. It's housing, it's jobs, it's the bread and butter issues that I dare say we've all campaigned on at one point as well, which 14 years of SNP being in power seems to be slightly overshadowed by the constitutional debate. Even in the last leadership hustings for the Scottish Labour Party, you had one candidate talk about how we need to be supportive of a second referendum, and obviously Nathar will say, well, I don't think we should be. My personal opinion is that I think we should be pro-union, and we need to be the case for it. But you know, I think we need to make the case as to why people should be back in the Labour Party in Scotland. You know.
Well, the Labour Party's traditions are about solidarity. I mean, they're about working across national boundaries. I mean, the trade union movement in particular has long been about that. And it would be completely against very deep traditions of the Labour Party to start embracing nationalism and putting up borders, breaking yourselves off from other people. And it would lead to the Labour Party being a very different phenomenon in Scotland if Scotland broke off from the United Kingdom. So I think there's really there shouldn't be a choice for either the Conservative or the Labour Party in their attachment to unionism. I think it's deeply within their DNA to believe that the United Kingdom functions better as a single unit. I think but you're right, the SNP have been very, very nimble and able about getting this story going. And it's a reminder of how unpredictable politics is, because you wouldn't have guessed in the 1970s that Scottish nationalism would be so successful. In fact, you would have thought that nationalism was really a phenomenon of the 1930s, and that as the modern world developed, And as people cared more about, for example, cared more about equality, cared more about jobs, cared more about housing, they'd be less and less excited by these kind of issues. But in fact, the opposite happened.
I mean, I actually find that really quite interesting. I think obviously, so next week we're doing this with Jack McConnell, former First Minister, and I think it was Jack that flagged up with Tony and Gordon about the rise of the SNP in Scotland. But I think at the time, being honest, I think the Labour Party was, well, just a small party, nothing to worry about. On that basis, I think maybe we made a bit of a miscalculation, because you've seen them go from being on the fringes to now politics, because I think maybe they tapped into something that the Labour Party had just kind of overseen. But no, you're absolutely right. And I think that's quite interesting. Normally, nationalism, you would associate with the 1930s, but here we are, 21st century, and it's still rife with the Nigel Farage's UKIP or Brexit Party or whatever party now is part of these. The Nigel Party.
Well, and the very clever trick that the SNP have pulled off to date is to be a nationalist party while pretending not to be a nationalist party. So they fall over backwards to try to say we've got nothing to do with parties like UKIP, and that we're very progressive, we're very embracing, we're very things which just don't really make sense with nationalism. I mean, nationalism in the end is about them and us. It comes down in the end to drawing a border and saying these people are different to us. But they're very good at having it every which way.
Absolutely. No, you're absolutely right. It's all about division. It's interesting because obviously where I am is in the Scottish borders, a wee place called Coldstream. And I remember during the referendum, they say we're going to have a hard border. And I was like, great, brilliant. I'm thinking about the job creation. It's like, come on, don't be ridiculous. You're not going to have Scottish people running across that border to get to Cornwall. I mean, this is now becoming a nonsense. It really is. But it's still there when you go in the doorstep with people saying, well, the SNP seem to be offering something better. It's like, what are they actually offering you? Point me to one policy. I'd like to see it, because I still haven't seen it.
But it's so difficult, Barry, because you're putting your finger. I mean, you're feeling it from the side of somebody who's been associated with the Scottish Labour Party and has therefore been through that terrible kind of disillusionment and loss from a very strong position in 2010 downwards.
Yeah.
Remember in 2010, there was it was the Conservatives who were being mocked for there being more pandas in the.
That's right. Yeah, nobody's laughing now, are they? Absolutely. Yeah.
And I've been through it in a different way. I've been through it over the Brexit Remain debate within the Conservative Party. But in both cases, it's emotionally difficult because one comes out a little bit bewildered, because you keep having these conversations with voters saying, what exactly are you looking for here? Why are you believing this? Why are you buying into this? And somehow not convincing people. And in my case, obviously losing. I mean, I obviously lost the leadership election against Boris Johnson. So at some level, one's suffers from doubt. I suffer from doubt. I'm left there thinking, did I not explain it well enough? Could I have won this debate? What went wrong? What is it I needed to say? How do you beat somebody like this?
Now, that's really interesting, actually, because, I mean, obviously, from an outsider's perspective, and very keen at the time with the leadership hustling. I mean, I think you were you could see how you were getting momentum, I think, with the members, and I think when the Daily Telegraph, you could see that you were having a real impact in the leadership hustling. And, I think the Conservative Party missed a ticket, and I do hope that you go back to politics at some point and go for it again, because, you are, in my opinion, a good politician. And we need more people like yourself. It's really interesting to hear about thinking about after did I not sell enough? What was it? And it's true. I mean, I remember being in Springburn. This would have been in the 19th election in Glasgow. No, it's the SNP. They're the ones I'm going to be supporting. It's like, but why? Is it education? Is it health? What are we talking here? And people have this idea that if we do break away from England, somehow that will be a better Scotland, which is a little bit. I don't say naive. I wouldn't want to insult people by saying that, but it's a little bit strange within itself. It's like me saying, Rory, if you vote for me and it's utopian Scotland, I will make sure you get a Porsche. Being voter, No,
it's amazing, isn't it? But this question of whether there's ever any route back is a difficult one too, because if you think about it, there are people who wanted David Miliband to have a route back. There are people who. I liked quite a lot of the Labour Party MPs in Scotland, as I say, from Frank Roy to Jim Murphy and all these people. And the question is, do they really have a route back? you know, what happens to any of these people, Douglas Alexander, any of them? So, I mean, politics is a very strange business, because it's not just about saying, as I might be tempted to say, you know, Jim is a very thoughtful person. That's not enough to really bring you back.
And I think that's the question, is a case of how do we get back from it, and how do we have a conversation with the electorate? And I think that, again, if you look at the poll that came about the SNP and the referendum, I think what we're starting to see now is, after 14 years of power, we're starting to see the SNP change. And I think a lot of that is probably with Alex Salmond, Nicola Sturgeon, the situation over the investigation that's going on. And I think it's starting to trickle down with some voters. Not all of them, but with some. And I think people will start to think, well, COVID has shown me that, you know, it's about the economy, it's about jobs, it's about health, it's about well-being. And the Labour Party, in my opinion, needs to have big policy ideas. We can't just simply say SNP bad, you know, vote for Labour because we have to be a little bit better. That won't wash with anybody. We have to be saying, this is what we're about, this is what we're going to put forward, and start showing them what we'd be like as a government, or even the Conservatives, who at the moment obviously in Scotland.
Yeah, but I think it's a difficult one though, Barry, isn't it? I mean, if you think about it, Joe Biden defeated Donald Trump without any positive program at all. He basically just ran on saying, this guy's terrible.
And I'm better. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. This guy's a terrible person. And it may be that works better with Donald Trump, because he's more obviously a terrible person. Maybe you can't quite do that against the SNP, but you've got to hope that after 14 years, people get a little bit tired. The wheels come off a bit.
Yeah.
People get a bit. But I don't know. It's a tricky one, because, of course, you know, Boris Johnson is now, I guess, into the 12th year of a Conservative government in Westminster. And as we were discussing, we don't really know whether the wheels are coming off or whether he's just getting a second bounce and is about to come charging back again.
It's difficult, isn't it? Because I think everything kind of rests on, you know, the facts have been rolled out, or rests on will there be an increase in the rate of inflation. And what he says, a cautious but irreversible approach. Okay, fine. I think, you know, I like a bit of spin as a PR guy, don't get me wrong, but I would not have endorsed that tagline, to be fair. But I think if there's another issue with the rate of inflation, I think Boris will come under a lot of pressure from Bob the country and from the 1922 committee. And I think on that basis,
Yeah, but on the other hand, I think the vaccination will make a huge difference. Yeah. I mean, the data at the moment suggests that even the first vaccination will make a huge difference to rates of hospitalization. So I think, my guess is that he's going to be assessed much more on what happens to the British economy over the next 2 years, and how people feel as we come out of the recovery from COVID, and how he manages the finances. And will he be able to deliver for Scotland? Will he be able to deliver for the north of England?
Well, again, really good points, because I think one thing that Boris did talk about when he was going through the hustings was about levelling up the north of England. It was about investment for the north and investing in Scotland. And you know, I think Rishi Sunak is going to come under a lot of pressure to, you know, not attack business. I think he wants to increase corporation tax. So it's going to be interesting to see what kind of budget gets put forward. I think it's Wednesday, and what we're looking at, I think Boris will probably try to avoid any form of austerity, because he would rather spend the money, again, go back to the populist thing, as well. But how is he going to deliver for the north? It's, you know, what's the plan? And you're right.
It's also fascinating, as you say, because, as you can imagine, the Conservative Party spent, whatever it was, 10 years trying to balance those books, 9 years, very, very painful, and believed that this incredible pain was somehow necessary for the economy. And it's very strange if Boris then turns around and says, actually, we don't need to do any of that at all. We can put up taxes, we can spend more, we can borrow more, because it suddenly must be very confusing for people. I mean, you know, people who had to spend 8-9 years defending what they believed was this kind of painful, necessary policy. Now to have a prime minister saying, no, it wasn't necessary at all.
Well, I think you're right. And I think from a Labour perspective, I mean, you know, the Conservatives put up taxes, to me, is a little bit, you know, like, kind of what's going on here? This is a little bit strange, but, you know, it's confusing. And I think, you know, a lot of people are going to be thinking that as well. And Rishi's going to have to somehow balance the books. I'm intrigued as to what he's going to put forward. And also from a Scottish perspective, I think they were talking about dealing with local authorities directly and not going through the Scottish government, which I suppose kind of plays into the whole idea about saving the union. Will that really have an impact on how people vote in the Constitution? In my opinion, probably not. If I'm honest with you, I think it needs to be a bit more than just we'll deal with the council leader as opposed to dealing with those in Holyrood. But it needs to be kind of well thought out policies and things that people can benefit from. And
one of the real challenges, I think, is that it's very difficult nowadays to come up with really big, eye-catching policies. So the secret, of course, for Roosevelt in the States with the New Deal was you could build the Hoover Dam, you could employ millions of people laying roads and railways. One of the problems in the modern world is that it seems that infrastructure projects are much slower. They take 10, 12, 15 years to come through. I mean, HS2, I suddenly realized that a Labour MP who I knew had resigned over HS2 back in, I think, 2005. They still haven't started. Because it ran through Stephen Pound, because it ran through his constituency. 15 years later, they haven't started building it yet, right? And the guy was resigning 15 years ago. So it's and it's the same with Crossrail in London. I mean, that was a project that began design in 1974 and hasn't opened yet. So one of the problems is that governments looking for things to deliver to people where you can see a quick, rapid impact and create jobs. The dream would be that you would, I don't know, upgrade the whole A9 in a very dramatic way that created tens of thousands of jobs, and suddenly everybody would see this. Or it doesn't seem to happen anymore. I mean, it's and even when it does happen, I wonder whether it has the impact. So maybe the SNP hope that the new bridge over the Forth would be, like the Hoover Dam, a great project that everybody would remember. But I'm not sure it's worked like that for them. I don't know, Barry, how did that bridge work? Did it?
I agree. I think, sometimes bridges go as a nice bridge, but I don't think it's going to, have a big impact on people in Scotland. But it's interesting to say that because, obviously I'm still for office myself. People say, well, politicians, you're all the same. You give a lot of talk and you don't really deliver anything. However, we should have those conversations. How do we deliver these infrastructure projects and how do we do it quicker? If you've got the political way and will, then I don't see why we can't do it. It's, well, how do we get around it? How do we do it? How do we make it happen? How do we show people that the money they're spending is actually being invested in their areas? Let's have that conversation. Let's really drive that agenda, because right now, I think Boris is now talking about another bridge, which is from Scotland to Northern Ireland. So,
But you see that bridge, I mean, but just talk me through, and what do you think the political impact of the bridge over the Firth of Forth was? Did it have any political impact at all? Or
I don't think it had any whatsoever. None whatsoever.
Right. And it would be even more irrelevant to have one running from wherever it's running from, Stranraer, where nobody goes. I mean, or not nobody goes, but very few people go compared to crossing between Edinburgh and Dunfermline, which is a much more common route.
Absolutely. And I think, in terms of political ramifications that we're now talking about, is it to have a kind of closer connection with the north to make it feel part and more closer to the mainland? I mean, again, it's not really kind of well thought through. Now, if you live in Stranraer, are you going to travel all the way to Belfast for a job? Potentially, maybe that would work, but I don't think it's going to be a hard-hitting infrastructure project that people say, do you know what, I'm now going to vote for the union basis of a bridge. It's just not going to happen. And I think a lot of people are quite sceptical of it. But again, if there's a rational other reason for doing something, then we should do it, but actually do stuff that's meaningful and get it done.
One of the problems is the confusion between, as you say, whether there's a rational reason. Somebody does a cost-benefit analysis and works out that spending money on this bridge is the best thing to do for the economy, compared to the political temptation, which is to get nice, shiny, big things that people can look at and say, wow, look, the government's done this for me. And I mean, goodness knows. I mean, that's one of the things that leads to this endless building of these sort of imitation angels of the north that we have all the way around.
Indeed.
Sort of dancing kelpies or strange things. I mean, endless attempts to try to make the public see, think that some great new statue's gone up that shows that something's happening.
Yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong. I think people like the kelpies. The kelpies are nice little story. But again, I think we can do a bit better than the kelpies. I think we could be looking at big. But let's be ambitious. That's what I want to hear from politics. I want to hear big, ambitious plans.
I mean, Barry, the challenge on the kelpies is somebody's got to think what to do on the other side of the motorway from the Kelpies, right? Somebody's got to come up with a real long-term solution to Grangemouth, and they've got to come up with a real long-term solution to the landfill side. I mean, the Kelpies are a sort of real kind of example of politicians dodging the difficult problems on the north side of the motorway and going for some mythical horse in an empty field on the south side.
No, you're right. You're right. I can just imagine how the conversation came about. It's like around the, but that's what we'll do. We'll have a couple of mythical horses. That'll keep people happy. But no, I think what it is with politics. And I think go back to the unions again. Is we're giving people the reason to see how the union works. I think you can see COVID. We see it with the vaccine. This kind of infrastructure. I mean, I'm all for anything that's going to bring investment in, provided it's done right and whatnot. Anything that will create jobs, prosperity, I think has got to be a good thing. And if you look at the Scottish Government in terms of what they've been delivering for Scotland over the last 14 years, there's not really that much you can kind of point in terms of what they've done.
So Barry, for me, the key challenge with any government, Labour, Conservative, SNP, is quality. So the key challenge really in Scotland, of course, is not the big ideas around education, but the quality of what's happening in the classroom.
Yeah.
The quality of education, the quality of the outcomes that the children are getting. Again, it's not the big debates about whether, the police service should be one or many. It's the quality of policing.
Yeah.
And trying to get people to focus in the way that you would, in a very straightforward way, you go, I don't know, lockdown ended, you go to get a coffee at you'd have a very clear idea on what makes for a good place to get a cup of coffee, right? You'd have a clear idea in your head about how long you wanted to queue for, how quickly your coffee arrived, how it tasted, how much it cost, and you were out the door. But when we're dealing with government, we don't quite think in that way, so that you end up with this very, very strange world where we don't really know. Are Scottish hospitals performing? Are Scottish schools performing? Are we creating jobs in the right way? It's all very, very vague. And a lot of the job of government is traditional management. And I think one of the problems is that we've lost our interest in traditional management, partly because politicians get the impression that voters don't really notice. I mean, sorry, they notice, it matters deeply to them, but they don't really reward or punish people at the elections for the details of how things are managed. So it's a bit of a lottery whether you end up with a politician who's interested in managing things well or who isn't.
Well, that's really interesting to hear, because obviously my experience for yourselves when you were the prisons minister, and I think what struck me straight away was you put your market down as I'm going to improve the prisons, and you did a good job, and you were having that conversation about how do we make more effective, what do we need to be doing. And for me, that's what we're missing in politics, is that, as I call it, and I'm in my kitchen, but it's like kitchen conversation. I would obviously have a conversation, what is about prison rehabilitation, what do we need to do? And you might not have a full policy, but you have an idea of what it is that you want to achieve. We need to have that in politics again. Let's get the ball going and talk about how we're going to get things sorted. Do prisons work in this country? Well, it's debatable. But we need to have that conversation and do it in a way that actually gets people thinking.
Well, I'm glad you said that, Barry. I mean, personally, I learned a huge amount from that job, that prisons job. Because by that stage, I'd been a minister, I guess. That was my fourth ministerial role.
Yeah.
And I was only just beginning by then to really sense what you can do as a minister and what you can't do.
Yeah.
And I realized that, well, firstly, you have to be quite lucky, right? One of the strange things in politics is you need a boss and you need a prime minister who's prepared to let you get on with things. You can't always guarantee that.
Yeah.
You need to be doing things that your party is at least not going to actively prevent you from doing. You need a civil service department that is prepared to work with you. And then, as you say, Barry, you need a relatively clear idea of what you're trying to do. And then you need to explain it clearly, not just to the public, but to people inside your organization. So in the case of prisons, I would think what mattered was that the prisons were filthy and they were dangerous and there were too many drugs. So I wanted them to be decent, less drugs, and safer. And then you get into the conversation about how you do it and saying, this is what I'm going to do in this some time, and if I don't, I'll resign, and trying to use that to move the whole organization with you. But the sad thing for me looking back on it is that that was the only job I did in nearly 10 years where I really felt I was able to make some progress, where I really felt everything lined up. It was as though I suddenly found myself in the position of being able to change and move things.
Yeah.
And I guess the reason I sometimes get a bit downhearted is that for the other 8.5 years that I was in politics, I never managed to really get going in the way that I was able to in the prisons job. And I worry sometimes that that's probably true, that is probably true of politics in general, that 80-90% of the time people are not managing to get very much done.
And that's very interesting, because I think if somebody's doing a briefing 18 months at a time, you cannot achieve that much within that kind of time frame to actually have a real impact. And I think, it's first of all, it's incredibly rare to hear somebody from a former politician be that candid and honest about it. And I think that is one of the issues with government, is giving people enough time to be able to actually have an impact and change. And it should have been, I think you did that, then you went to international aid after that, wasn't it?
Yeah.
You need to have the time to be able to excel on the role and actually get things done. Otherwise, it's like the think of it in some respects. It's just another minister comes along with a red case doing the job, and where do we go? But the conversation with prisons is still relevant today as it was when you and I met back then as well. And
but it's such a problem, isn't it? I mean, sometimes you look at ministers and you think, thank goodness they were moved on pretty quickly, because they clearly had no interest in the job. They clearly weren't doing anything, so you might as well get them out. Sometimes, colleagues have been left in departments for 7-8 years and got very stale and ended up doing absolutely nothing. The problem basically is the whole way that ministers are managed. They're not really selected for aptitude. So the reason they're reshuffled so quickly is that, as you can pick up, an organization that works like that, where the average tenure of a minister, I think, is about 9 months, 10 months, tells you all you need to know. It tells you that these jobs are not serious, that the prime ministers just don't really care. Otherwise, they wouldn't move them every 9 or 10 months. That was true under Blair, that was true to some extent under Brown, it was true under Cameron, it was true under Theresa May, it was true under Boris Johnson. I mean, basically, they treat these jobs as ways of rewarding different factions in their party. They're not, it's not the way that you'd run a normal organization, a business, a civil service department, where you're sitting and running an interview process, trying to work out which of the candidates is best for this job, and then getting them to commit for 4 or 5 years in that job and getting behind them around it. It's a very, very odd way of doing it.
It's strange, isn't it? And I suppose that's one of the strange things about politics, is that very reason. You're not doing it based on competency or ability, you're doing it on, you gave me support as I was going for the leader's role, I now have it, so let me reward you with this particular brief. And that's not necessarily the best way to kind of get good results. I mean, do you think that will ever change in politics? Do you think that depends on who the leader is?
The only way that could, the only really radical way that could change is if you suddenly found an opportunity to go for more of a US system, where US presidents obviously get to choose their cabinet from the entire country. Right? We're choosing our ministers from this very limited pool of members of parliament. Whereas, I know some of these people who've just gone into the Biden administration. They are the smartest foreign policy thinkers in the whole United States. And they're not people who probably would ever become Congress people or senators. So you'd have to change your constitution, I think. You'd also have to deal with the fact that, the skills which generally make, maybe not generally, but make for a lot of successful politicians, have nothing to do with running something well. They're to do with, Boris Johnson would be the classic example. They're to do with a particular style of talking to voters, talking to the media, talking to the party, building their name, building their credibility. It's nothing really to do with how he did or did not perform as foreign secretary, or what exactly he got done as mayor of London. Nobody can tell you any of those things, right? And that will be true for most of these governments for the last 30, 40 years, right? It's not, I've been very complimentary about the Labour Party and a bit rude about the Conservatives. So let me flip it around. It's not obvious, for example, that John Prescott was a particularly able cabinet minister, right? I mean, what John Prescott was somebody that Tony Blair felt needed to have a position, needed to be rewarded.
Yeah.
Whether John was really brilliant at running whichever department he was running, not clear, right? The same may be true for, I don't know, for Gavin Williamson in education at the moment, right? Is it that Boris sat down and said, is this the ideal guy I need to run the school system? Or is it that he thought this man ran my leadership campaign, this man was the chief guy?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And that's how it goes in politics at the moment. You get a reward for being part of somebody's team. And that's probably never going to change, to be fair. But I do think that if somebody's going to be given a base, there should be agreed key milestones. What does he want to achieve? What do you want to do? I think, getting back to the prisons, it's very much about having that conversation about prison system, rehabilitation, does prison work? If it doesn't work, what can we do? What other things could we be doing as a society? What if it goes back to poverty?
And maybe, Barry, one other thing which never happens, which is you'd like a situation where the Prime Minister felt, I've got a problem here. I've got a crisis here. This is the department that matters, and I'm going to get my best person and put them in. But that oddly doesn't seem to happen. Any of these jobs I've had, I mean, I loved the prisons job, and in a short time, I felt that I was able to do some things, but I didn't get it because Theresa May sat down and thought, I've got a crisis in prisons. Who's my best person? I got it sort of, I don't even have any idea. Actually, some people say that I was given it as a sort of punishment post because they thought I was too much of a threat and I was going to get into the cabinet. So one of the rumors was, I was given this because famously prisons go wrong and this was likely to blow me up. So it's sort of random. And again, I didn't become Secretary of State for International Development, even though it suited what I knew in the past, because somebody thought it through. I got the job because the Defense Secretary resigned and they wanted to put somebody in to replace Defense Secretary. And 4 months earlier, they were talking about making me Lord Chancellor. Right? I mean, so it's a very, very odd system. It cannot be the right way to run things. It can't.
It's a bit like a picking mix in Woolworths or just like this anymore. Essentially, go in, what do you want, Lord Chancellor? We'll take a bit.
Exactly. Or chimpanzees and a dartboard.
Absolutely, you throw enough, you're afraid you're going to hit something, aren't you? And it's quite worrying in some respects. I think this is how governments operate, and I would like to see people get appointed based on ability. Even passion. If somebody went and said, I really am interested in the business and I want to make a big difference. This is my plan, and this is how I think we can offer it. Because you and I both know if you get it right, you can save the taxpayers' money. It can be done better. You get better results. Darren's a classic example for some of the kind of work-based initiatives, and we need to see more than that, because having something like prison system itself doesn't really rehabilitate. If anything, they're there, and then when they come out of prison, they could be homeless and whatnot. And one of the biggest issues that we had, in fact, that you helped us with, it was with a case with the probation where somebody had to go to an area, but we didn't want to go there because of the impact it would have. And thankfully we got it sorted. So we still need to have that conversation, but equally, I think, we all go to politics to make a difference. I've never met anybody who says I'm going to politics because I love austerity. We all go in.
Although, Barry, let me, it's an interesting one, that, because you're right. Everybody, when MPs give these speeches when they're leaving the House of Commons, they all say everybody goes into politics to make a difference. Maybe that's true, maybe that isn't. I mean, I sometimes think when I hear that's not saying anything special about MPs. Probably every human being alive wants to make some kind of difference. But if I was really asking whether MPs want to make more of a difference than people who work for charities, for example, I'm not sure I'd be that confident in saying that.
No, that's actually a really good point, actually, to be fair. And I don't know, maybe we need to look at the caliber of politicians that we have, or people that go for it. And I think that some people look at the thick of it and might go, well, that's what politics is like. Maybe to a certain extent, we've all identified with certain people in the thick of it, but as we all know, that's not really, life of Westminster and parties. But I think for me, it is about going in with a passion and an idea of what you want to do. But about yourself, politics, do you see yourself going back to politics at some point?
Well, I'd love to. I mean, I love the subject matter. I mean, it's been an amazing 10 years in politics, and I learned an incredible amount. But I suppose the fundamental thing I learned is that it is like a sort of being in some bizarre, I don't know, tribe stuck in the middle of the jungle with incredibly strange rules and ways of behaving and sort of magical rituals and total fluke and chance and an incredibly inefficient way of doing anything. I mean, you're sort of, I mean, I sort of feel that you're on a, I don't know, you're scooting around on a roller coaster, trying to shoot something with a water pistol as you go past. And it's apparently that's the way in Britain the whole thing's set up. And if you want to have a chance of hitting it, you've got to get on that roller coaster with your water pistol. But it's not a very direct way of doing it. So going into it involves accepting that you're going into a world where the likelihood is that you will emerge at the end of 30, 40 years saying solemnly to an empty chamber in the House of Commons that you managed to get a lift installed in your local railway station 15 years earlier, or that you once served on a committee that was involved in some piece of legislation that nobody remembers, and you'd like to thank your local agent and their constituency association, and off you go to your pension. So it's a very, very, I mean, the relationship between being an MP and achieving anything is very, very, very indirect. I mean, if you read those, I mean, sometimes I'm fascinated by these goodbye speeches they give when they try to list what they've achieved. Unless they've been prime minister or a cabinet minister, they're things which are, I don't know. I mean, you know, my friend Madeleine Moon, for example, when she gave her goodbye speech, she majored on the fact that she'd sat down a coal mine for, I think, 22 hours and stopped the government from closing it, which was great, except, of course, it was then closed 10 years later. So what had she done? She kept it alive for another 10 years. But all the reasons that people were going to close it 10 years earlier still made that they closed them. So I think you have to be very, I think you've got to be a real kind of philosophical sage to be a politician. I mean, something like Madeleine Moon needs to have a wonderfully kind of whimsical, wise view of the world to think about a life in which what she achieved was delaying the closing of the mine by 10 years, but it still got closed. And thinking about, you know, I think she will feel great pride in that and great joy in that, but it's a difficult thing to explain to somebody who's not in the business.
No, I can understand that. And I think, you know, I could see when that could become quite frustrating. And I think that if you're an intellect and you think about the issues, I could see politics being quite restrictive in some respects, especially when you just want to get on with the job and get stuff done and not necessarily be remembered for it's all on a lift at, I don't know, Berwick upon train station. They have two, so they'll need to get them installed there. But and I don't know if that was Alan Beef, but maybe it was. Maybe I'll Google after this actually and see if Alan's landmark is two lifts in Berwick. And if Alan's watching this, hi Alan. But yeah, you know, I think, you know, politics can be quite frustrating for a lot of people. I think it can be quite, you know, annoying on that basis because, you know, a lot of people go and do what they want to do. Then I think even Tony Blair said when he became Prime Minister, you realise very quickly that what you want to do and what you can actually do are two very entirely different things, and that's even having the levers of power as well. So it's time to look at a new system, time to really go in with that agenda, go, right, we've been elected, we've got a 5-year term, let's do as much as we can and really push it as much as possible, which is what I'd like to see. You know, just keep on doing it. You know, don't sit about and talk about it, and don't go to strangers. You know, just stay away from it. Just do your bloody job. You know, do you think you'll go for it again at some point?
Yeah, I think I'd like to, but we'll see. I'd have to be. I mean, things would have to change a lot. I don't think there's no political party out there at the moment that's very keen on this particular independence. So I'd have to find a party.
I know one party that's keen on independence, Rory. If you fancy maybe standing by a yellow tree or something.
Well, Barry, thank you for having me, and it's been a great conversation.
You too, Rory. Much appreciated, and do take care of yourself. We'll be in touch soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Take care.
That was great.